Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen, and in today's video we are going to ask the question, to rhyme or not to rhyme? So we're going to be talking about poetry and whether poetry should rhyme. So we're going to explore what a rhyme is. We're going to look at the advantages of rhyming and non-rhyming poetry. And we're going to look at other ways in which a poet can enhance the musicality of a poem. Should poetry rhyme? If you ask this question in a room full of poetry lovers, then it's quite likely that a very heated debate will ensue. When I searched "should poems rhyme" on Google, here are some of the answers that I got. Poems don't have to rhyme. A lot of poetry doesn't rhyme and it still works just fine. No, a rhyme should rhyme. 10 reasons every poem should rhyme and how it could impact you big time. Rhyme is an important part of many poems, to the extent that, to many people, rhyme is synonymous with poetry. Rhyme is a tool, not a defining characteristic. And my favourite answer: first of all, like falling in love, we do not choose rhyme. Rather, it often chooses or finds us. That being said, rhyme can also be very challenging. We want to express something compelling, moving and thought-provoking while providing magic elements of imagery, often within a melodic flow. Reading it should be effortless. So as I read through these answers, I started to wonder, what is the difference between the terms poem, rhyme and verse? Is that where the answer actually lies? So here are the dictionary definitions of poem, rhyme and verse. A poem is a piece of imaginative writing arranged in a particular rhythm and also often in rhyme. A rhyme, when used as a noun, has 3 meanings. It can be a word that has the same sound or ends with the same sound as another. It can be the similarity of sound between words or the ending of words. And it can be a short poem with rhyming lines. And a verse is writing arranged within a regular rhythm and often having a rhyme. So according to these definitions, poem and verse are essentially the same. They often rhyme, but they don't have to, and rhythm is also an important element. A rhyme is both a linguistic phenomenon, in which words have similar sounds, as well as being used to refer to a poem that rhymes. So, a rhyme is a poem, but not all poems are rhymes. Going back to the answers that I found in my Google search, let's take a look at the 10 reasons that every poem should rhyme, according to Kenny Myers. The first one is establishing structure and rhythm. So he's arguing that if a poem rhymes, it helps with the structure and the rhythm of the poem. Assisting in memorization. So if a poem rhymes, it makes it easier to remember. How many of us had to learn poetry by heart when we were at school? Number 3 is adhering to style guidelines, and he points out that there are particular formats for writing poetry, so we should stick to those. And anybody who's studied poetry will know there are all sorts of different formats, different rhythms, different rhyming schemes that poems can follow. Creating symmetry. So if a poem rhymes, there is a certain symmetry to it because one line rhymes with another line, so that creates some symmetry in the poem. 5, it appeals to younger audiences, so children find rhyming verse more pleasing than non-rhyming verse. Number 6, it appeals to older audiences, so he's arguing here that older people like a poem that rhymes. Number 7, carrying on a grand tradition. So if your poem rhymes, you're following in the footsteps of lots of great poets who wrote rhyming poetry. Number 8 is rising to a challenge, and he's saying here that it's quite a challenge to write poetry that rhymes, especially to write poetry that rhymes and is good. Number 9, lightening the mood. If something rhymes, it creates a slightly lighter mood. It lifts the mood of a poem, whereas non-rhyming poetry can be quite gloomy and introspective and deep. And number 10 is fulfilling an artistic vision. Do I agree with these points? I think all of these points are very true. Rhyming poetry does assist with memorization. Rhymes do help with symmetry and rhythm. They are pleasing to read when they're written well. They do appeal to younger people. A lot of older people do enjoy rhyming poetry. There is a lot of truth in here, but it doesn't mean that every poem should rhyme. This just points out the benefits of the poems that rhyme. It doesn't point out the benefits of the poems that don't rhyme. Poetry is a very subjective subject. People have very different opinions on it, and poetry, the writing of poetry, is intensely personal. So opinions vary hugely on this subject. My own opinion is that poetry should have some kind of musicality. It's a form of music made with words. It's also an art form. It's like painting, but with words. It's an elegant and sophisticated form of self-expression. So the words should fit together and flow beautifully to create an effect, or paint a scene, or convey a message, or induce some kind of emotional response. The musicality of poetry is what makes it a coherent piece of art, rather than being just a collection of words. However, there are other ways to produce this music besides rhyming. Rhyme is just one tool that a poet has at their disposal. There are other ways to add musicality to your poetry. So because poetry is an art form, it's a bit like painting. If you're learning to paint, then you begin by studying past masters. You look at how the great painters before you have painted, and you study their techniques, and you listen to other artists and the advice that they have to give. But when you've done that, when you've taken all that information on board, you have to take your own steps. You have to find your own style. You have to experiment, see what works and what doesn't work, what you like and what you don't like, and how you can express what you want to express through your art. And poetry is the same. We should read what other poets have written, the great poets from hundreds of years ago, modern poets writing today. We can listen to what other poets have to say. We can go to poetry workshops, read books on writing poetry, and learn as much as we can about the craft of writing poetry. But then there comes the moment when you have to take your own steps. You experiment for yourself. You see what works for you and what doesn't. Let your poetry express what you want to say in the way you want to say it. If rhyme comes and you like it, then use it, but don't force it. Forced rhyme starts to sound comical or awkward or even quite painful to read. If a complicated word is inserted into a poem just because it rhymes, or if a colloquial word is used at the end of a line in a poem that is in a much higher register, then it doesn't fit. It's only there because of the rhyme, and it doesn't work in the poetry. So if rhyme comes naturally, use it. If you have to force it, then perhaps consider writing poetry that doesn't rhyme. When you start to explore poetry, there is so much poetry out there in so many different styles. You won't like it all, but if you look hard enough, you will find that there's something out there for everyone. So let's take a look at two poems, one that rhymes and one that doesn't. And let's weigh up the advantages and disadvantages of each one and see what other techniques the poets use to make their poem more musical. The first poem we're going to look at is the ever popular The Owl and the Pussycat by Edward Lear, who was famous for his nonsense poetry. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money, wrapped up in a 5-pound note. The owl looked up to the stars above and sang to a small guitar. "Oh, lovely pussy, oh, pussy, my love, what a beautiful pussy you are. You are, you are, what a beautiful pussy you are." Pussy said to the owl, "You elegant fowl, how charmingly sweet you sing. Oh, let us be married, too long we have tarried, but what shall we do for a ring?" They sailed away for a year and a day to the land where the bong tree grows. And there in the wood a piggywig stood, with a ring at the end of his nose. His nose, his nose, with a ring at the end of his nose. "Dear pig, are you willing to sell for 1 shilling your ring?" Said the piggy, "I will." So they took it away and were married next day by the turkey who lives on the hill. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with a runcible spoon. And hand in hand on the edge of the sand they danced by the light of the moon. The moon, the moon. They danced by the light of the moon. So obviously this poem has a very definite rhyming element to it. In the first verse we have boat and note, above and my love at the ends of the lines. But then we also have some rhymes in the middle of lines. They took some honey and plenty of money. Honey and money rhyme. And then in the second verse, "Oh, let us be married, too long we have tarried." Again, a rhyme within the line, not even just at the ends of the lines. And every verse, there are 3 verses, and every verse follows exactly the same pattern. It has the same line length, the same rhyming scheme, the same lines rhyme with each other. The rhymes within the lines occur in the same line in each verse, and so on. And at the end of each verse, we have a little bit of repetition. So in the first verse, we have, "What a beautiful pussy you are. You are, you are, what a beautiful pussy you are." So we get "you are" 4 times. So just as music repeats motifs, repeats little patterns, so has Lear done here with the words. And as I already mentioned, Lear was famous for his nonsense poetry. So he introduces certain nonsense elements, such as the bong tree, for example, and the whole image of an owl and a pussycat falling in love and being married by a turkey is complete nonsense. The nonsense element of it makes it light-hearted, gives it a humorous feel as well. Let's look now at a rather different poem. This one is When I Heard the Learned Astronomer by Walt Whitman. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself. In the mystical moist night air, and from time to time, looked up in perfect silence at the stars. There is no rhyme in this poetry, but it is nevertheless a very beautiful piece of poetry and very musical in its own way, and it's also conveying a very interesting message. So how does the poet do this? Well, first of all, if you look at the poem on a page, you can see the shape of the poem. The first line is quite short, and the last line is quite short, and it builds to a very long line in the middle and then goes down again. And if we look at what he's saying in those lines, what he's saying actually follows that pattern as well. So the first line begins, "When I heard the learned astronomer." He's in a room listening to a talk in an academic setting. The second line mentions proofs and figures ranged in columns before him. So he's being presented with lots of information, lots of numerical, factual information. The third line piles on even more information. "When I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide and measure them." So it's a very scientific line, full of lots of detail, lots of numerical detail, lots of charts and diagrams, lots of mathematical calculations. And then the fourth line is the longest of all. "When I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room." So he's panning out with his camera to the whole lecture room, not just the screen where the information is being presented, looking at the audience who are listening and applauding this learned astronomer with all his facts and figures. But where are the stars? The stars themselves are not in that room. There's only information. There is only academic data in that room. So the poet decides to go outside. "How unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself." So he's abandoning all the people, he's abandoning all the information, and he's slipping out quietly in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. So the very simple last line, he's in silence, he's alone, and he's with the stars. So what he's saying in this poem is that the true beauty of the stars can only be found by looking at the stars themselves. All the facts and figures and calculations are as nothing compared with just standing alone, gazing up at the night sky and taking in the awesome sight that is the stars. Like Edward Lear, he does use repetition. The first four lines all begin with when I heard, when the proofs, when I was shown, when I sitting. So that adds some emphasis to each line and it creates a rhythm. When I did this, when I did this, and when I did that. He also uses some contrast. He contrasts one situation with another. He contrasts the academic lecture hall with being outside alone and with the stars. And it's that contrast that gives us his message. And then the rhythm of the poem also comes from the language itself. English is a stressed language. That means that in a word that has more than one syllable, one of those syllables will have more emphasis than the others. So for example, astronomer has the emphasis on the O, astronomer. Columns has the emphasis on the O as well. Before has the emphasis on the second syllable. We don't say before, we say before. So good poetry makes use of the stress of the language. So if you imagine a conductor with a baton conducting this poem like an orchestra, you can imagine the beat of the baton going down with every stressed syllable. You can feel the rhythm of the poem coming out in the stressed syllables there. So there we have two examples of one poem that rhymes and one that doesn't rhyme. The rhyming poem, The Owl and the Pussycat, is very musical in feel and it has been set to music. But it's also very light-hearted. What is the meaning of the poem? It's very entertaining, it's humorous, it makes us smile. Whereas the other poem isn't setting out to be humorous, it isn't setting out to make us laugh. It's setting out to convey a much more profound message. So the different format lends itself better to helping us understand what the message underneath is. If it was rhyming, it would probably make it feel lighter. It might just take the edge off it, which is probably not what the poet wanted to do. And now for our language focus. Let's talk about rhymes, what rhymes actually are, and what the difference is between a rhyme and a near rhyme. A rhyme is the repetition of the same sounds at the ends of words. Usually in a poem or a song, it's at the end of a line, although as we've seen in The Owl and the Pussycat, it can occur in the middle of a line as well. And it's used to create a musical or aesthetic effect. Because rhymes only concern the sounds of words, the spelling doesn't have to be the same. As we know, in English, many words that sound the same are actually spelt quite differently. So a perfect rhyme, also known as an exact rhyme, occurs when the final stressed syllable and any other syllables after it are identical. So in The Owl and the Pussycat, we had boat and note, above and my love, guitar and you are. A near rhyme or a half rhyme contains sounds that are similar but not absolutely identical. So boat, for example, is a half rhyme with most. It has the O sound and they both have a T in them, but most has an S as well. So it's nearly a rhyme but not quite. Boat and most. Above and unloved. So you have the of sound in both of those, but in unloved you have a D added on the end as well. So most of the sound is the same, but there's just one slight difference. Guitar and sincere. Guitar ends in R, sincere ends in ear, R, ear. They're similar, but they're not identical. So it's a half rhyme. And now for our writing prompt. In The Owl and the Pussycat, the owl looks up to the stars above, and in When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, the poet is gazing up at the stars as well. So have a go at writing a poem about stargazing, and write 4 verses about looking up at the stars. What you see, what you think, what you feel. Write verses 1 and 3 in a rhyming format, and write verses 2 and 4 in a non-rhyming format. Then read what you've written. Does it work as a poem? Do you prefer verses 1 and 3 that rhyme, or verses 2 and 4? Which are the nicest to read and which were the most fun to write? And why? As usual, there are worksheets to accompany all the video lessons, and they can be downloaded in packs of 10 lessons from our website at writtenwords.uk. Also on the website are details of my book, A Month of Writing Ideas, which is a book of writing prompts, and it contains one for every day of the month to help you build a writing habit or just to use as a source of ideas. Thank you very much for joining me in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy writing.